Hello, my name is Jim. This is my podcast, The Bloody Vegans. You're very welcome to it. Each week, I'll be traveling ever deeper into the world of veganism, discovering along the way a multitude of viewpoints from the political and ethical to the practical. I'll be doing this through a series of conversations, each aiming to further illuminate my understanding and hopefully yours of all things plant-centric. And this week is no different. I'm going to be chatting with Phil Bryden, the co-owner of Mush Nutrition. Based out of Barcelona, Mush Nutrition are certified plant-based sports nutritionists, co-owned by Phil, as I said, who focus on athletes across a variety of different sporting disciplines, from tennis, rugby, cycling, you name it. They're also yoga practitioners and all-round holistic health practitioners, if you like. Phil's got a vast array of experience across the sporting world, and most latterly is actually an author. He wrote an incredible book called You Are Beautiful, well worth checking out, and you can find out a lot more following this conversation, should you wish to do so, and I would strongly advise you do. But without further ado, this is a conversation between me and Phil Bryden from Mush Nutrition.
I grew up in Los Angeles, in California, and went vegan for the first time in 1987, 86, 87, and was completely vegan there until I moved to Europe, until I moved to Europe in 1992, at the beginning of 92. And I got to France, and being vegan in France in the early 90s was kind of, let's put it this way, it wasn't very easy. They weren't very user-friendly towards people who weren't meat-centric. So I stuck with it as long as I could there, and then just kind of, it just kind of slowly slipped away, because it was important for me when I moved there to kind of fit into their culture and their way of thinking, and I didn't want to be involved with any of the sort of expat stuff going on there, and I wanted to really get sort of involved in what was French, and so if I didn't want that to be a barrier, and so I kind of let it go gradually, and then it just kind of slipped away. And I got back into sort of more lifestyle changes a few years ago, and really dialed it in. I could kind of gone non-dairy and dropped the wheat and dropped refined sugar and a lot of other things many years ago, and then finally just went completely back into full veganism about 4 years ago now.
And was the journey kind of originally one health-based, as a kind of nutritionist? Was that the original kind of seed for it, or was there kind of ethical reasons? What was the sort of port in, if you like?
Back in the 80s, it was much more, and I would say almost exclusively about for animal rights. That was my first entry into it. At the time, I wasn't working as a nutritionist. I was involved in television. When I was in the States, I went to a film school at UCLA, and then taught school after that before moving to France. So I was kind of more into it for the animal rights side of things. I was quite active and involved in cycling, like long distance cycling, and did a lot of cycle touring in Europe during the summers. Led some tours, and was we'd go for thousands of miles over the summer. So I kept a lot of journals when I was in university. And I would journal just for my own information, kind of what foods I was eating, how it made me feel, how I was able to perform and physically and everything else, how it made me feel emotionally for no reason other than my own interest. It was kind of something you would do if you were sort of a competitive athlete and you really wanted to chart progress and that kind of thing, but I wasn't. And I still kept those kind of really detailed journals. So I was able to see how it affected my health, but that wasn't necessarily the reason for it at that time. It was when I got back into it, like I say, 4 or 5 years ago.
And so 4 or 5 years ago, was that when the kind of the training as a nutritionist started? What inspired you to become kind of like as kind of well versed and kind of academically astute from a nutritional standpoint?
Well, I've spent most of my life working in sports from a media perspective. I was a camera operator for many different sports and have a company over here in the States that covers endurance sports, cycling and running and triathlons and that kind of thing. And I think it kind of the impetus for me to make a career change, as it were, came after my father went through a series of kind of preventable diseases that eventually led to the end of his life, and he passed away in 2014, April of 2014. So seeing sort of his very gradual demise over many years of things that could have very easily been prevented by nutritional changes and lifestyle changes and that kind of thing, and his sort of resistance to making those changes and the ultimately pretty gruesome end of his life, I thought that's not something that sat well with me, obviously, as a son and as a family member. So I thought, well, this is something that I've always been passionate about. Throughout my life was nutrition, and I've always been interested in it. And I thought, well, I want to kind of make a shift away from the television sports world and into something that has more of an impact and is ultimately maybe giving back a little bit to the world. And I thought, okay, this is where I have sort of the interest and maybe a bit of a calling, is through the nutrition.
Yeah, sure. It makes perfect sense, and you can see those kind of worlds would start to draw you towards nutrition, like you say, the story with your father's health, and then the sports side of things. It certainly makes sense, and it's interesting going right back to you sort of having this kind of mindset quite early on about journaling and diarising and seeing what is connecting your performance, or what connects your performance to your nutrition. That's kind of an interesting sort of seed that was sown quite a long time ago, by the sounds of it. When you sort of these things started to kind of like converge in your mind, did you, having made the connections and links you'd made in the sports world, did you kind of instantly know where that sort of formal side, that formal education would come from? Or was there a bit of a self-taught process and then kind of formalizing it?
Well, I think the decision to really dial it in for myself came before I decided to formalize and go back and get formal education to be able to practice as a nutritionist. But I knew early on that I wanted to be involved in sports nutrition, and specifically plant-based sports nutrition, because as you mentioned, I'd been around sports for 20 plus years and seen different performances and different athletes and the way that they worked in their own lives. And it kind of made me think, well, okay, a lot of these guys are just going with advice that their team is giving them. Very few actually take that on board themselves and go, okay, this is what I'm going to use to really dial in that extra 1 or 2% of performance so that I can be better than the next guy, they would basically just take what was given to them food-wise and eat it. I was around cycling quite a bit, and you would have these cycling teams who they would travel with, the team chef, and he would make sure that their food was clean and proper in a very very technical sense, because he didn't want anybody else preparing the food. So he would prepare the food, but what he was preparing for them was not necessarily performance-based. It was based on, giving them what they wanted and making it taste good, well-rounded, and the whole thing. But there was never a huge amount of emphasis on using nutrition for performance. And so that's something that I thought, this is really where I want to go.
And so there was a bit of a learning journey for yourself then. And was this predominantly around kind of cycling, or were there other sports that you were kind of passionate about on a personal level and involved with, that you almost sort of could experiment on yourself and see the changes with?
Well, the endurance sports is always where I've kind of leaned toward myself, be it running or cycling. That was always something that those are the sports that I was always involved with as a practitioner and from the television side of things. But also quite a bit of tennis. I've shot tennis for many, many, many years and saw how that worked as well. And so once I got the diplomas and everything, was able to practice as a professional, we got involved with a tennis academy that's just outside of where we split time with in Barcelona. So that was kind of our entree into the world of working with professional athletes. Was first off at this tennis academy in Barcelona.
And then was this the sort of the onset of Mush Nutrition then? So as soon as you'd sort of done these diplomas and started to work kind of professionally with this tennis academy, had Mush Nutrition started then, and the kind of very plant-centered nutrition that you were talking about with clients, or had that sort of not quite come about yet?
No, Mush Nutrition was sort of the first thing that came about. My partner Candace and I, our original plan was to open up a place in Barcelona that incorporated yoga and paddleboarding and sort of plant-centric foods for performance, as a cafe, as sort of a meeting place, as a sort of a multi-purpose venue. And we were quickly confronted with some of the difficulties of opening up a business in Spain, not being Spanish and everything else. So we kind of put that on a back burner a little bit. But that was, when we were starting to talk about that was where Mush came from. And because I used to make up these, I still do, but make up these bowls that just kind of incorporate a lot of different foods, and I really like to work on food combining. So it was the combination of different foods, and we would call those the mush bowls, because it's these different things coming in to the same meal. And so she kind of coined it as, well, mush is when great things come together, and it's yoga and paddleboarding and food and art and all these different things that we wanted to incorporate in this venue. And so that kind of became Mush. Just kind of, we threw it out there and it kind of stuck. And so when, I said, well, okay, I need to, have a name for the nutrition business, it just was Mush Nutrition. It just made sense to us.
And so did the tennis academy kind of come looking for you, or at this point were you starting to build your client base, sort of more you reaching out to folks? And was there interest, one of we want some nutritional advice, or was this we want some nutritional advice from someone who has kind of plant-based experience and is centered around veganism?
We reached out to them. We were there, and we wanted to really sort of incorporate what was local to us. So I just kind of cold called quite a few of the tennis academies there because it's a little bit of a hotspot for tennis right around Barcelona. So I contacted them, and one of them got back in touch and said, yeah, let's come over and have a chat. And we did, and they were looking for someone to look after their players on a nutritional level. And so it fit, but they weren't looking for plant-based. They were looking for just someone to get incorporated with the academy on a nutritional level. So then we brought our plant-based approach to it, and some of the players adhere strictly to it. Some of them don't really, and kind of do their own mix with it. But it's a tricky one because nutrition is one of those things that is it's a very personal decision, and it's a very personal choice. I mean, it's one of the only real choices of things that we do in our lives that we're 100% responsible for, which is what you ultimately decide to put into your mouth, what you decide to eat. And so you can advise people, give them the pros and the cons and the pluses and the minuses and all that stuff of why they should eat this and why that would be better for their performance and their health and everything else, ethically and environmentally. But if they decide that they would rather have this than that, they're the only ones who can make that decision. No argumentation, no kind of empirical proof to the contrary can persuade someone unless they're ready to make that shift themselves. So we've got a couple of the players who are completely plant-based, and the others are they have their own mix with it.
No, it makes sense. And of those ones who've kind of gone all in, or even some of those who haven't gone all in, but have sort of acting upon some of your advice, or the majority of, have they kind of reported? Is there a noticeable shift in performance, recovery, all the kind of things that you typically associate with plant-based nutrition?
Yes, I think there's some specific cases of a player who was ranked in the ATP rankings. I think he got up to a ranking of in the low 200s a few years ago, and then encountered a series of injuries and sort of physical mishaps, preventable ones, and he kind of started to make some shifts himself. And then our collaboration with him, and him really dialing in more his diet and his training and everything else around that, he had slipped down to in the low thousands in the world rankings, and now he's back up to right under 300. So that's a huge recuperation for him. And once you get into the sort of mid 200s, you can start to have access into some of the Grand Slam tournaments. So it's a big switch on his level, and that's primarily, I think, the injury prevention and everything else there's a huge amount of that comes from the plant-based decisions that he's making with his food.
I was going to ask you that, sort of for people who don't necessarily know, because as we talked about, for many people, or approximately 2/3, their route into veganism wasn't necessarily the health. So the health is kind of a natural byproduct that may come about, and of course, as we all know, you can be a very unhealthy vegan as well. It's they're not necessarily both completely hand in hand, but from your perspective, what are the kind of like headline benefits that are achievable through kind of good planned plant-based nutrition
on a health perspective?
Yeah.
In terms of athletic performance, I think you can't really have any kind of performance if you don't have your recovery dialed in. The recovery establishes every baseline for athletic performance. So if you can reduce your recovery time and improve the quality of your recovery, then that means that you can train harder, train longer, be more performant in the actual competitive aspects of your sport. So if we can diminish the impact of recovery through plants and through food and through nutritional choices, well, that to me is at the top of the pyramid in terms of athletic performance. In terms of non-athletic nutrition, I mean, you can prevent a series of the main diseases that are the killers in the Western world. Chronic heart disease, diabetes, all sorts of diseases that are related to inflammation, and that inflammation all is coming from the things that we put into our body. The microbiome in our gut, the good bacteria, is responsible for our immune systems. So that bacteria is fed and develops based on what's put into the body. So if you're putting a ton of processed foods and high in sugars, high in fats, high in chemical extracts and whatnot, then that bad bacteria feeds on that, and it kind of creates its own cycle. Whereas if you're putting in whole foods, a variety of fruits and vegetables and grains that are naturally occurring, then that supports the good bacteria and allows them to grow and supports your immune system and reduces inflammation. And then you don't have those knock-on effects of preventable disease. So, it comes down to, on the athletic side, the recovery, and on the non-athletic side, it's also recovery, because you're recovering essentially from the meals that you eat on a daily basis. And are those meals good or are they negative? What's the input? Because there's very little that you put into your body that's completely neutral. It's either tipping the scales on one side or the other.
I'd love to just explore that a little bit, just for someone who's a bit of a layman like myself, this microbiome piece here. So you mentioned there that kind of essentially processed foods, high sugar diets, etc., feed this kind of bad bacteria, if you like, and the whole food plant-based kind of diet does the reverse, feeds the sort of positive bacteria. So therefore, I'm reading into that it's possible to switch somebody's gut microbiome over the course of a period of time, and what sort of would that take in order to do that?
Well, you can definitely influence the microbiome by what you're putting into your body, 100%. And that switch can go. It depends on how out of balance things are. If you're just slightly out of balance, then it's very easy to bring things back. Just by making some minor changes, or if you're someone who goes all in on decisions to go, okay, I'm not going to eat that anymore because I've had it, I'm done with it, and I'm going to, favor whole food plant-based nutrition as opposed to the other stuff, and I'm really going to go all in on that. You can see changes within days or weeks, and that it's an interesting thing with the microbiome, because not only does it control what physically happens in your body in terms of inflammation and immune responses and all of those kind of things, but it also influences what goes on in your brain emotionally and mentally, mental clarity, emotional stability, emotional responsiveness. Your brain doesn't tell your body how to digest food. That the digestive process is an autonomic process, so it happens without consciously you affecting it. But that process certainly affects how your brain triggers, how your brain fires. A lot of people refer to the microbiome as the second brain. Your gut is the second brain, because it is so involved in determining how you react to things around you. Then in terms, like I say, of mental clarity and emotional reactions and all sorts of how can I put it? The way that you sort of emotionally and mentally interact with the world around you stems from what's going on in your microbiome.
No, that makes sense. And on that note, then I've got a bit of a, I guess it's quite a broad and potentially complex subject to get into, but I'm kind of interested on your perspective. So, sort of, I suppose modern society, if you like, there's an awful lot, and I'm sort of careful to how I try and word this, but there seems to be a rise in people suffering from anxiety and depression and mental health conditions and illnesses, and to some degree, I suppose that is due to better diagnosis and us being more open about these subjects than perhaps we were in history. But I'm interested in your perspective from a dietary point of view on whether you see kind of diet being linked to these things enough, and certainly linked to people's recovery and leading them to better mental health through nutrition. Do you see enough of that as it stands, or do you think there's a fairly big kind of gap in the kind of medical mental health treatment world, if you like, to do with nutrition?
I think there's a huge disconnect still between physical and mental health and nutrition. You know, when a physician goes to medical school in the States, it's 7 years of medical school before you can be a practicing medical doctor. And on average, that medical doctor, after 7 years, will have received somewhere between 3 and 6 hours of nutritional information over a course of 7 years. So nutrition is not necessarily the first influence that these doctors look for to solve problems. You know, their vocation, their training is, okay, recognize a symptom, recognize a sign that's going on in a patient, and let's eliminate that symptom. Let's eliminate the problem that person is coming to me with. It's very rare that you get a physician who says, let's look at what's going on and see if we can cut this off at the source. You know, let's find the source of the problem. And if you treat the source, then the problem just inherently goes away, but goes away for a long term. If you treat just the problem, then you're treating that problem. And if the source is never dealt with, then the problem just keeps popping back up eventually. When you talk about the stress levels and the anxiety and the mental sort of pressures that people are dealing with on a more frequent level in today's day and age, I think there is, like you said very aptly, there's more precise diagnosis for that kind of thing now. But I think there's also a greater availability of processed foods. There's a lot of hidden sugars and chemicals and things like that in these processed foods that we consume. The Western world has become one of, performance is a huge requirement, work performance and relationship performance. And now with all sorts, this whole panoply of social media, there's all of those kind of, sidebar performance almost related issues with that. There's a lot of comparison that goes on just based on, social media input.
I guess that one of the key points there that you sort of pulled out, that the difference between the sort of system, if you like, in the kind of current medical world, traditional Western medicine, and say like a nutritionist is about time to build a picture. So dealing with a person and not a symptom. That's kind of the key element, I suppose I'm picking up, right?
Well, yeah, I think the traditional medicine tends to be a bit reductionist in terms of boiling things down to a symptom, boiling compounds in the world down to very specific isolated compounds that this one medicine can treat this one symptom, and may have other side effects and whatnot. But I think there's more of a need and more of a desire, I think, nowadays for people to go toward a more holistic approach. And by holistic, like I was saying before, it's more of the whole person. It's taking into account everything that person is, because it all influences what's going on within that person's body. It influences the diseases that they're going to get, their past, their interactions with other people, their genetic imprint, their lifestyle habits, the way that they go through every day. That influences how healthy or unhealthy a person can be, and how quickly they can actually heal themselves by making changes into the whole picture, not just into getting rid of an aggravating symptom. Just making it's almost like a creating a paint by numbers kind of thing for each person, because each person is going to be different, but it's just the questions that you can ask and the things that you can look at could be the same for each person. But how you fill in, which colors you fill in, and how much of that space gets filled in by this color is going to be different for each person. It's like we're all built with the same organs, the same bones, the same number of bones. Our physical structure is the same for every human being. The color of our skin, the color of our eyes, the color of our hair, our size, the timbre of our voice, the way that we walk, everything else is different. But the basic components are the same for everybody. So it's just how does all that stuff work? And it's the same with lifestyle. How do you look at what your habits are in your life? It's the same things. What do you eat? How much do you sleep? How much water do you drink? What are you putting into your body that has a positive impact? What do you put in that has a negative impact? And being able to kind of give yourself an honest assessment of that, and then say, okay, what are the connections that I'm making? If I eat this, do I feel like this? If I don't eat this, do I feel better? Or if I eat this, do I feel worse? Do I sleep better when I haven't had a couple of drinks before I sleep? Or do I sleep better when I go to bed at 10 o'clock or when I go to bed at 1 o'clock? It's being able to recognize patterns in your own existence that can then allow you to sort of dial it in. And it's within the realm of every person to do that for themselves. I think sometimes it's easier when there's an external voice that can kind of almost like a sounding board to throw some of this stuff up against the wall, and then someone else can maybe recognize patterns that you wouldn't recognize in yourself. It's like having an extra set of eyes on things.
I was going to say that because I think that's that idea that bit of being able to sort of have the time and B, the kind of insight to be able to self-reflect in that way is quite challenging for lots of people. I know for myself, almost the process of talking that out loud with somebody or sharing that is kind of critical. I wouldn't be able to identify exactly how I felt at a particular moment if I didn't almost build those moments of either self-reflection or conversation with somebody to talk about that, So that totally resonates.
Well, and I just recently started working with an athlete who, the first thing that we do is I go through and do an assessment with them, and their likes and their dislikes based on their food, what's their training schedule, what are their goals, what are, all of those kind of things. And create, ask them for, through the week to keep a food journal. What do they put into their bodies at what times, and how are they, and just very basically, how do you feel? At night, do you feel tired when you go to bed? Do you feel a little bloated? Do you feel this? Just very basic stuff. And I get the food journal back from this guy, and it's very easy for me to look at it and go, oh, okay, well, if you shift eating carbs at this time instead of eating proteins, your digestion will be a little bit easier and you might sleep a little bit better. But for someone who's kind of in it and difficult to recognize, because, well, I've always had this as sort of my late night snack before I go to bed, and now I'm just starting to feel this. It's very difficult to identify patterns when they're your patterns, because it's so close and it's so much part of you that it's just part of you. But you get someone outside of it who's not looking through the through the microscope at it, and just gets a broader picture, and it's a lot easier to identify broad patterns, I think, with an external set of eyes.
Yeah, and I'd imagine there's a cumulative effect to some of our habits and behaviours that sort of mask things for us on an individual basis. I'm thinking, when you mentioned there about this, like, I always eat that thing at night, or I always have that drink at that particular time. That that might, I guess, not have an impact on your body, and instantly it might be a compound over days and weeks and months. And so you might blissfully go on saying, well, actually, no, it can't be that, because I've drunk that for 3 months before I felt like this. I'd imagine that's how it could play out if you're just looking at it yourself.
Well, absolutely. And there's nothing that we do in our lives that is isolated. It's all compounded by other things. So trying to extract one thing of, okay, well, I eat this at this time, maybe that's what makes me feel like this, is very difficult to do when you're the one who has those patterns and you're the one who has those behaviors. Because you might think, well, okay, you might send me your food diary, and I say, okay, well, Jim, when you eat this, an hour later, for the past 4 days, you've said that you felt heavy or you felt bloated or whatever else. So maybe shift eating that to a couple hours before you go to sleep and see if that changes. But for you, the eating of it is normal, and that heavy feeling when you go to bed has just become normal. That's just kind of become what things are. So isolating it and kind of pulling it apart and deconstructing it is not always easy to do when you're talking about yourself.
Yeah, totally. Do you find that that's sort of just as prevalent, or perhaps less prevalent with athletes? Because I'm just thinking, again, from the point of view of a layman who definitely wouldn't describe themselves as an athlete, although I enjoy lots of sports, but I would imagine, or my perception is, that athletes would be very in tune with their body. Do you still find that relationship with either with a nutritionist or somebody having that conversation with them is just as critical for them as it is for any of the rest of us? Or do you find that they are slightly more in tune with their body in that way?
To be honest, I think there's maybe even a greater disconnect with athletes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And how so? I'm intrigued as to that point.
Well, for professional athletes who make their living through their sport, I think there's a tendency to not really put into question a ton of stuff, because to get to that level, they're in the top 1% of 1% of people practicing that sport. So they think, well, I'm already here. I'm already at the top of my game. So, you're going to tell me I'm doing something wrong? when I'm at the very, very tip of the pyramid of the people who are in my sport. So there's a little bit of that, and there's a little bit of it's interesting because there's two types of athletes. I think there's some that kind of look at things and think, okay, this is what I've always done, so I'm not changing a thing, almost to a superstitious level. And then there's the athletes who are looking to dial in every little ounce of perfection that they can get out of their being, whether it's mental, concentration, physical, emotional, recovery, whatever it is. They're looking to really tweak it to the nth degree so that they can have that little bit, they might get 1/10 of a second out of making these 3 different changes in these 3 different ways. But that 1/10 of a second may be the difference between them getting a gold medal and them finishing 4th place.
I know. I imagine cycling is one of those that sort of jumps to mind when you mention that. I think of the kind of the Team Skies and the 0.1% that they talked about with that team, and the compound effect, the cumulative of you keep adding those 0.1% and you get there. So yeah, I can totally imagine that would be the case with athletes.
Yeah, so with some of them are very tuned into that, and some have a much greater disconnect with that. It just depends on the individual.
Yeah, and the point you make there about athletes with this sort of almost like superstitious nature is kind of intriguing as well. That it's almost like, well, I don't want to change a single thing that got me to this point. I've worked so hard to get here. I can't possibly change a factor of that. Almost like a footballer saying, I've got to put this sock on before that sock. It almost becomes that level, I guess.
Oh, 100%. If I eat, if I have this drink followed by this snack 90 minutes before match, and I went out there and had a great match, well, I'm going to do that same thing the next time. And if it works again, well, it must be that thing that's working. And who wants to take the risk of changing it? Who wants to put their right sock on before their left sock if the left sock's been the one that's going on first and making them have all these these great matches? It defies logic sometimes, but it's a huge part of professional sports.
Yeah, and I guess it's like rooted in psychology, isn't it? I suppose it's there's if we were sort of chatting to a sports psychologist, they'd probably say, well, that's also a critical part of that person's sort of process, if you like, is the socks or the energy bar at the right time or whatever.
Well, exactly, because those things are the things that are within that person's control, and if they can line up a routine that allows them to go through a process that process has shown results for them, and that process allows them to visualize those results because they've already had them, and they think, okay, if I do this again in this same order, then that's going to be what gets me to the end game. Well, sure. I mean, why not?
Yeah.
Why not?
Totally. No, it makes perfect sense. I'd love to, moving away slightly from athletes, I'd just love to get into the sort of broader vegan nutrition, if that's okay, just for a little while. So, I've been vegan for 3 years, but I've never really spoken at any great length, sort of personally, with a nutritionist. And we've talked a little bit about modern society and culture and social media and so on and so forth. And one of the great things, but also one of the biggest challenges I find, is that there is the world is awash with information. I wouldn't necessarily say whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. It's just awash with it, and it can be a real minefield for someone going into the world of veganism. For me, it was, I watched Cowspiracy, and from that moment was like, that's the end of that. I can't possibly do that, and had sort of I guess, had in the back of my mind that all of the things that people had said to me about vegans before, that you're probably going to die of some protein deficiency and waste away, and you can't possibly get omega-3s or iron and this, that, and the other, and you're going to end up unhealthy. And I kind of at that point thought, well, it is what it is. I can't contribute to climate change to that level. And as I've gone through the journey, I've kind of started to, you read into things and you figure things out, and there's multivitamins and there's this and there's that. And but I'd love to get your view on sort of the common pitfalls and the things for you that you really think, for the general day-to-day person taking on veganism, they need to think about and tackle from a nutrition point of view.
Well, I think it's pretty simple from how I approach it. I'm not a nutritionist who sits there and says, okay, you have to count your macros. You need X amount of grams of protein and this ratio to your carbs and this ratio to your fats. That's totally valid and totally legit. It's just not how I approach it, because as a person, as a human being, we don't eat macronutrients. We eat food. So breaking that like creating another step so that it's no longer food, that it's protein. I mean, you look at you create a meal, let's say a plant-based meal with grains and some veg and maybe some avocado and all sorts of different things that you go, oh, that's a great meal. Which one of those is the protein? Which one of those is the fat? Which one of those is the carb? Because they exist in all of those foods to varying degrees. So it's very difficult for me to advise people to break down and eat a certain ratio of macros. So I would encourage people to eat the foods that they like, favor whole food, plant-based nutrition over processed foods, eliminate wheat as much as possible, especially processed wheat, processed grains, flours, that kind of thing, sugars, all that kind of stuff. That I would encourage someone to eat a well-rounded, whole food, plant-based diet rather than a processed diet. And that can be vegan or not vegan, because there's, like you said early on, there's as much junk food out there for a vegan, and you can still go, I'm a vegan, but that doesn't have anything to do with health. All it has to do with is not eating animals, which is a fantastic initiative, but doesn't have anything to do with health.
And so from the kind of like the classics, the B12s and the irons and so on and so forth, how much should somebody be concerned about those things that they're sort of seeing and reading in social media, etc., about vegans being instantly deficient in those things?
Well, the thing is that B12 at its origin comes from the soil. It comes from bacteria that exists in the soil. So yes, hundreds of millions of years ago, when we were pulling plants out of the soil and eating them, we were getting the B12 that we needed, which is a very small amount. And your body can store B12 for up to 6 months. So it's not something that you need to be concerned with on like a daily supplement kind of thing. People have in their minds that B12 comes from animals. Where do the animals get their B12? Well, they used to get their B12 from foraging in the fields, from eating grass and from eating the same place that it came from before, the soil, those bacteria in the soil. But now 99.5% of our beef and our lamb and our chicken and the meats that people are eating are factory farmed. And so those animals are not actually eating out of the fields. They are eating processed and produced grains, which contain in and of themselves zero B12. So the animals that we're eating to get the B12 are themselves being supplemented with B12. So cut out the middleman. If you want to get the B12, then just take a supplement. You can take you can take a B12 supplement once a week, twice a week if you want. I would suggest that for somebody who's concerned about it, but there's enough foods that you can find also as that come into a plant-based diet, like nutritional yeast and things like that, which contain B12 and are fortified in B12, and that will give you what you need. If you're concerned about it, pop a supplement once a week. In terms of iron, I think you can get all of the micronutrients, the vitamins and the minerals that you need to get through a well-rounded, whole food, plant-based diet. And if you're concerned about the availability of iron, that sometimes people say, well, you can't absorb that iron because there's two different kinds of iron. There's heme iron and non-heme iron. The heme iron is from animals and is absorbed readily by the human body to a point where your body doesn't recognize when it's had enough, so it can over-absorb the heme iron. The non-heme iron is a plant-based iron, and once you've reached your level of iron that's required for your body, your body stops absorbing it. So it's a more self-regulating one. It's a little bit more tricky to absorb. You can enhance the absorption by adding some citrus to it. So when you're eating a salad with some quinoa and vegetable and whatnot, squeeze a lemon over it. That'll enhance the absorption to a point where it's as efficient as taking an iron supplement.
Excellent. Love that. Some top tips there. And the final one that's on my mind is the omega-3, because that's definitely one that I've had. Well, I've found as we all do, I think, when you become vegan, you find yourself in a number of debates with people. Rightly, wrongly, voluntarily or involuntarily, everyone becomes a nutritionist when they hear you're vegan. And so they all want a debate. And the one debate that I seem to get a lot of at the moment is omega-3. So I'd love to hear your steer on omega-3 for folks who are either vegan or considering being so.
So where when people talk to you about omega-3s, where are they thinking that you should be getting your omega-3s?
So fish seems to be the one that constantly recurring, that essentially the popular view is that you couldn't possibly get omega-3 from any other source reliably, consistently, apart from through eating fish.
Well, exactly. And much like the animals who don't produce B12, they're ingesting it from their food source. It's exactly the same thing with fish. Fish are absorbing the omega-3s through the algae in the water that they're swimming in. So if you are eating some seaweed, eating some kelp salads, that kind of thing, you're getting the source of the omega-3s that you would be getting by eating fish. So if you can include some seaweed salad mixed in with your quinoa or your rice, you're giving yourself a strong source of omega-3s. Other omega-3s sources are walnuts, high in omega-3s, and flax seeds. If you add some ground flaxseed to whatever, sprinkle it on top of your salad, add it to some cereal. Once the flaxseed is ground and the husk is broken on the actual flaxseed itself and it becomes the flaxseed powder, it's very easily absorbed by the body, and it's a super source of omega-3s, as are walnuts and seaweed. So the fish is again, it's just the middleman.
And you don't have to ingest all the plastics and mercury and all the rest of it.
Exactly.
Which is also a great benefit, right? So I'd love to just get chatting to you, because time is racing away with us, actually. We've been chatting for a while now. But I'd love to talk to you a little bit about the book. And we've obviously covered a few of the sort of, just a few of the tiny elements of the book so far, but it's an absolute treasure trove of information. So I'd love to to get your kind of the story of, you know, where did you come up with the idea for the book, and you know, what were you hoping to kind of achieve for folks within the sort of vegan, non-vegan community through it?
Well, I think the book was, I didn't want to write a book on nutrition. I didn't want to write a book on, you know, yoga and yoga ethics. I didn't want to write a book on, you know, my personal life experience, because who really cares? But I thought, okay, if I can pool all of those together and use some personal life experience as the thread that kind of links all of that stuff together, and talk about nutrition as it relates to ethics, as it relates to health, as it relates to Eastern philosophy, as it, you know, just to kind of create a whole picture. Again, I really like the approach to whatever it is that we're talking about, whether it's nutrition, whether it's ethics, whether it's environmentalism, whether it's you know, a personal being, as a whole entity. So I think I tried to go about writing this book as if it was kind of a little bit of a holistic look at, you know, well-being. And that's why the title of it, "You Are Beautiful," is, I mean, that came, the cover of the book, for those of you who will see it, is it's a stenciled painting on cinder block that says "You Are Beautiful" above a sink. And that was actually the toilets of a restaurant that I went into in Thailand a couple years ago. And instead of the mirror that you would normally see over the sink, there was this stencil that said "You Are Beautiful." So when you look up to look in the mirror, as everybody does when they're washing their hands, it just came back at you, "You are beautiful." And whoever you are, and whatever you look like, and whatever you are in the world, you have that potential to be beautiful. And you can make it, you can shape it, you can determine how that is for you.
That's a wonderful sentiment, and it's a wonderful book. I mean, like you say, it covers so much ground. I did want to touch upon the yoga side of things, actually, because being completely honest, when I sort of became vegan, and then it was probably 3 years before I'd spoken to anybody who kind of was it was actually a yoga practitioner I was chatting to, and I'd never heard the connection, really. Completely naively, I had seen yoga as kind of, you know, perhaps great from a mental well-being point of view, meditative and so on, and great physically from a, you know, I suppose the becoming more flexible and so on and so forth. But these were just the kind of broad strokes of things I'd pieced together through sort of pop culture, if you like. I didn't have any idea of there being a connection with veganism. So it's kind of awesome to see that reiterated in your book and yoga talked about. I'd love to again get your kind of perspective on how the two interlink.
Well, there's the basis of yogic philosophy is it's called the 8 limbs of yoga, and this is kind of like, on the sort of Judeo-Christian equivalent would be the 10 Commandments, if you would. It's the blueprint of, okay, to lead a yogic lifestyle, this is where you go with it. And it starts with the yamas and the niyamas, which are like the first 2 levels, and then it goes into the breathing and the asanas, the postures, and then the different levels of the meditative process to get you into a higher state of consciousness. But those first 2, the yamas and the niyamas, the yamas are your relationship to the outside world, how you relate to the world around you. And that's, you know, non-stealing, non-harming, you know, non-abundance, all of those things that are kind of the way that you, according to the yogis back, you know, thousands of years ago, that was how you should relate to the world around you. don't do anything that harms another being. Don't do anything that harms yourself. So you take that to a degree now, and you can apply that to, okay, harming another animal, harming the environment, harming yourself by ingesting foods that are harmful to your organism. So that's just the very first of those sort of precepts as to how you should relate to the world around you. Then the next ones are how you should relate to yourself, your internal self. And all of those rope back into doing things that are going to raise your level of consciousness, yes, but also raising your level of physical acts, physical being, who you are to other people, who you are to yourself, raising that to a level where you're basically having to be responsible for who you are in the world. And taking that responsibility and taking those precepts as, okay, if I can walk my path without causing harm to another being, without being untruthful to the outside world, to relate to bring that back to what you're talking about with yoga. A lot of people will go out and go through a yoga teacher training and go into teach a class and talk about the wonderful, the enlightenment and the meditation, and how you can bring yourself in the union of the mind and the body. And, after yoga class, might go out and grab a hamburger, or might, scream and shout at the person in the parking lot who took their parking place. That's a total and complete disconnect from those precepts, because they're not just how you should be relating to the world around you isn't just when you're in a yoga class. It's not just when you're leading a practice. It's not just when you're talking about that one thing. It's all the time. It's in every level and every aspect of your life. So the fact that, people say yoga is vegan is that idea of non-harming and being respectful and taking care of the world around you and the world inside of you to the highest level that you can. And that entails not causing harm to yourself and not causing harm to the things around you.
That's wonderfully put, Phil. And that really does, I think, paint the picture that how intrinsically linked they are. And like I say, something I just had no idea about before. And I still think a lot of people don't, who I've come across anyway, within the circles I've moved within the vegan community, especially I think as veganism's exploded almost, or feels like it has. I'm careful to say it has, because I still think we're, obviously it's only 1% of people, whatever, but there has been a rise in veganism, but not necessarily all the kind of elements of it. And like I say, there's so much information out in the world now, we don't necessarily piece it all together until hopefully we hear somebody like yourself sort of telling us how these things link. So, thank you for that. Appreciate it.
No, it's a pleasure. I hope it makes sense.
I'm sure it totally does, and I'm sure it will inspire some people to kind of look deeper into yoga. It certainly has me. Time has, like I say, got away from us, but I do want to encourage people to get in touch with you and to get hold of a copy of your book, because I couldn't recommend it enough. It is holistic, like you say, and covers so many aspects of veganism, nutrition, optimal health. It's just an amazing one-stop shop for people. I definitely recommend it. So where can we get a copy of the book, and where can we get in touch with you and the folks at Mush Nutrition?
Well, thank you for your thoughts on the book. That's very kind. The book is available through Amazon, and you can get a paperback copy through Amazon or a Kindle ebook version, and those are both through Amazon.com, .co.uk. Whatever Amazon outlet is yours, you can reach it through that. I'm easily, you can find me on Instagram at Mush Nutrition, and that can be either through direct message or through my website, which is mushnutrition.com. So those are the best ways to get in touch. What else? Email, Philip at Mush Nutrition. So, yeah.
Awesome. Phil, well, thank you so much for your time. Do stay safe out there and in the current situation, and really appreciate your time amongst getting back safe and well over to the States. So thank you. And like I said, do everyone check out You Are Beautiful, an amazing book by Phil, and explore Mush Nutrition online as well. Thanks so much, Phil.
Thanks so much, Jim, for having me. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.